All right. Okay, so we're gonna get started. This is a lot more people than I thought, but that's awesome. So I'm gonna ask a few like opening questions before I actually start my presentation, just to kind of get an idea of where everyone's at. So how many people actually use JavaScript? So it seems like fairly everyone.
Do you have any other choice? I don't think so.
Dude, you can do everything in C++. Of all the people that raise their hands, how many people have actually used promises before? Nine. Okay, so a fairly good amount of you, but not a lot. What are you guys, I guess, comfort level with promises? Is it like, are you really experts in promises, or are you guys just kind of using it because some library is giving you back a promise and you just had to use it, figure it out? Okay.
That library Angular.
It's an Angular library. So I'll be talking about promises tonight. I've been promising to make this presentation for a while, and I finally got around to it. So a few caveats. Everything that I talk about in this presentation is in the context of the Bluebird promise library, which I think is probably one of the fastest, if not the fastest promise library. And it's fully conformant to the A+ spec. So the downside to that is if you've used promise libraries such as Angular or Q or When, and I think a few other ones, they have a slightly different idea of how promises are used, and they use a defer pattern. So with the defer pattern, basically you create a deferred object and that gives you a promise, but you resolve on a deferred object, and then the promise takes care of anything that happens afterwards. So that's a slightly different pattern than what I'm going to be showing you. So just keep that in mind if you guys are familiar with Angular or Q. We're also doing this virtually as well. So we might have some questions from the virtual class. And basically, feel free to ask questions whenever you want. So if I get interrupted, I don't mind. If you have any questions, point out something wrong, let me know. And I guess we'll get started. So if you want to actually look at the promise spec, that's the link right down there, the GitHub link to the actual promise spec. And let's go. Yes.
Live access to the slides?
Yes, there's live access to the slides if you want them. I don't know what the link was. Yeah, it's probably slides. Slides.com/Tessup, which is my name, TAESUP/promises/live.
Thanks, man.
Yep. So what are promises? A promise represents the eventual result of an asynchronous operation. And the biggest problem with promises is their documentation, because I still don't know what the hell this means. But basically, promises are what happens after something else. Oops. I'm going to go with this. What does that mean? And that's the hardest part, because a lot of times with a promise library, you're not really given anything. You don't really start anything. You're just kind of given something and say roll with it. But really, this is what a promise is. So you have two functions at the top portion of the code, which basically are two callback functions. And what promises really allow you to do is kind of run those in a synchronous order, and it cuts down on the code a lot. So you can tell the difference right off the bat with the top portion and the bottom portion. I am using a couple of tricks that promises give you to make the code even shorter that you may not always use. But basically, just keep that in mind. A lot of promises is basically turning callbacks into something that's synchronous, and at the same time cuts down on the amount of code that you have. So basically, promises release you from the shackle of callback hell, and which is one of the most controversial things about JavaScript. A lot of people say JavaScript is bad because of callbacks. And a lot of times it's because people don't understand really what callbacks are and the power of callbacks. So before I say go ahead and use promises on everything, I really want people to kind of understand what callbacks are first. So you can kind of appreciate exactly what promises do for you. At the same time, you kind of understand when to use promises and when to use callbacks, because they're very similar, but they're slightly different beasts. But basically what a promise does is it wraps a function, and you're given two callbacks for that function. basically something that happens on a positive note and something that happens on a negative note. And then when that completes, you're given a then. A then is basically a continuation of that original function with the values that either came out of the positive function, the positive callback, or the negative callback. Any questions so far? So one of the main things about callbacks or promises is if your promise isn't really working, try to write your promise in a callback fashion, and basically that'll show you where your logic is kind of going wrong, because anything that's in callback form can easily be turned into a promise form, and kind of vice versa. But if you try to write something without really understanding promises and it's not working, you're not getting your thing resolved at any point, it's probably because of a underlying logic error with the code itself. So usually a lot of times putting it back into callbacks kind of fixes that error, because you kind of see where it's synchronous, what leads to the next thing, and what needs to be returned, where you're not making your resolve or your reject call. So with that, promises are really written with the idea of writing code synchronously. So that's a lot different than concurrently, which is what kind of callbacks give you, but is the main thing that fixes one of the things in callback hell, which is basically how do you keep your code from being 16 times indented and still readable? So basically a thenable or a then or a thenable, as some people call it, is basically anything that returns a then. And basically, since it's returning the original promise object, it's chainable. So you can keep doing more and more thens on everything that comes out after that. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that. I have a few notes on handling errors, but I think I'll hold off on that till later. So basically, I've been talking about how basically a thenable is something that comes after the promise, and how it's a then, and then you can chain it, and you can do more thens, and it's all a synchronous process. But how do you start a promise? Well, you probably won't be starting any promises, to be honest. For the most part, most libraries are starting to support promises or can be modified to support them. So I've been talking a lot about Angular and how Angular many times will return you a promise or will return you a callback. And it's possible because JavaScript can handle both. So you can return a promise or you can return a callback, and it's completely up to the person that's actually using the function afterwards. Okay, I lied. Sometimes you do need to start your own promises, and a lot of times this comes from when you're writing some code, you're writing your own function, and you want it to return a promise so that in the future you can chain off of it and do some more stuff. So one of our first code examples is how to start a promise. So again, this is all using the Bluebird syntax, but basically you create some function at the top and you'll return a new promise. Promise is basically the Bluebird library at this point. So anytime you see promise, think Bluebird library. And then in that promise, you're basically just given a function with a resolve or a reject callback. You do something with the parameters that were passed into the function, and basically you're returning this entire object, this promise object, right off the bat. And there's really no other code around that. So basically, as soon as your function executes, it's just returning this promise. The magic happens because within this promise, nothing's actually returned, and this function is still being executed until resolve or reject is called. So basically, you can think of it as a callback within a callback, kind of like a closure, where the closure doesn't actually finish until something calls back on it. So with that, you can resolve with whatever you want to return, or you can reject with an error. So you can kind of think of the JavaScript callback signature where you have the error value in your callback. And that's basically how you're kind of breaking that out. So if you really look at this is basically calling a callback with error and value. Except flipped. So to kind of continue on that, you'll call this some function, you give it some parameter, it'll do something, and if you resolve with whatever you want to return, that resolve will be this result. And you do something with the results. So maybe you ask Twitter for a bunch of tweets, and you do something with a bunch of those tweets. The nifty thing with callbacks is you can reject, And instead of handling the error here in this function and then doing a console log or whatever, and then not knowing exactly where in your code base that's going to be, you can actually catch it at this point, and this will give you the error. So this itself is actually a part of promises or Bluebird more than promises. Sorry, but all your errors will be in this area.
Is that if you call reject directly, or if you
Yeah.
if you throw exceptions in the
So
promise?
it's kind of going ahead of what I was planning, but yes, that's actually true too. So one of the cool things about promises, especially the Bluebird library. So I can't really talk too much about other libraries, but I know for Bluebird, it basically wraps a try catch around that entire function. And any errors that get thrown at that point will be sent to this catch.
And since that's chains with like met, then, and catch.
Yep.
That means you can't put another then following.
You can.
Okay, where
So-
would it go after the catch?
So you can actually put a then after, so ignore the semicolon, put a then after this. And what actually happens is, in the positive scenario, you'll run into some function, you'll call .then, and then this catch will be ignored because there's no error being catched, and the secondary then will be called.
I see.
But that's also weird because if you do have a negative scenario, say that an error gets popped up in some function,
Right.
this then doesn't get called. This catch will get called, and then the then will get called. So your then after a catch has to be able to handle both of those, which is kind of a weird scenario, and I try to avoid that because I feel like it's gonna be a bad pattern in that point.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be able to handle that. Your catch, your first and only catch, should be the end of that promise. Anything after that should be kind of in murky waters in my opinion.
So
Like
basically,
finally.
Finally is also there too, but I wouldn't use finally to actually handle logic. Finally is probably better used to handle either resources that need to be like closed, like connection pools. There's actually a .dispose resource in Bluebird that actually handles that better for you. But finally is probably something you might want to call in some scenario where you're doing a whole bunch of operations and your .finally is there to make sure that you close a lot of those operations. You need something that needs to be done regardless of whether you have a positive or negative scenario.
nice.
So in that scenario, a then at that point is very similar to a finally, but a finally I think conceptually or semantically in code is a lot more readable in my opinion.
Question.
Yep.
Is this like Q in that it'll give all of the errors from whatever it was just on to the first catch it finds down the line?
Yeah. So promises will basically wherever the error occurs, it will call up the stack until it finds the first catch that it finds, and that's where it's gonna kind of leave it at that point. Which in the long run is kind of nice because you know exactly which catch is gonna get hit. As long as you write your code legibly, you know where it's gonna go.
That's a big assumption.
It's a lot better in callbacks, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And technical difficulties. There we go. So what if you want to do things concurrently? So a lot of times this whole time I've been talking about doing things sequentially with promises, but you can actually have the same kind of power that callback does, where you can fire off a whole bunch of callbacks and use maybe like the async library to wait until everything kind of comes back, and then get one final callback at the end of a whole array of callbacks, and finally do something with that array. So you can kind of do the same thing with promise.join. I'm not exactly sure if this is part of the promises A+ spec, but the Bluebird library does give this to you. So if you want to think about it this way, there's two different functions. Both return a promise, and I'm not really thinking too much about the reject, so ignore the rejects for now. But basically, it'll spark up power, connect to power, and give you a sparked. Pump will, let the fuel flow and then return pumping. So you call these two functions, and these are basically just handlers to that function, and they'll get passed here. So it's kind of hard to think about this in terms of what's being executed at what point in time, when you kind of bind these two functions to a handler like this, these two functions are actually being started when you call fuel pump equals pump gas. It's actually going to be instantiated, but what's happening is the promises are being returned at this point, and this promise.join is going to take those two handles to those two promises and wait till both of them actually resolve. And when they're both resolved, then the then will actually execute. So at this point, actions is going to be an array of sparked and pumping. So .then in this scenario won't run until both promises are completed, so or resolved or rejected. So if either of these reject in some scenario, the .then will not execute, but the catch will execute at that point.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a risk of the promise finishing before you get to the join?
It doesn't matter. So if you want to think about it this way, this function or this function, regardless of whether they complete on time or not, what you're returning is a promise. And a promise is basically, not to sound too weirdly, a promise of a future execution.
Oh, I see.
So what that means is it could be done, it could not be done. All that matters is I will tell you when I am done.
Ah, I see.
And at that point, all the join needs to know is when both of you are done, then I can do my next then.
Makes sense.
Does that really?
Yeah, makes
I don't
sense.
know. Okay.
And does the promise start execution immediately after you declare it? Like after the var fuel pump equals pump gas, does it start?
Yeah, it starts executing immediately.
Okay.
So because all you're really returning is a promise. You're not returning the execution of the function.
Right.
So the function can execute as quickly as possible. You don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
All you have to worry about is handling that, giving that handle to the promise back,
I see.
so that whoever wants to work with it can work with it.
So the line where it says var fuel pump equals pump gas, that actually starts something?
Yep.
And then the var start, so it creates that promise and then it starts executing the body of it in a separate thread or something?
Well, with JavaScript, it's in the same thread.
Okay.
So it's always single threaded, but yes, you can think of it kind of as running in a different thread.
I mean, maybe, I guess I'm not really dialed that down with JavaScript, so I'm not sure what you mean by thread, but in general, if something is if you start something and you only have one thread, then you don't do anything else until it's done, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think it starts right when you call it. It starts when you call join or .then.
No, it does start.
It starts right away?
Yeah, it starts
And
right
how
away.
is it,
Because a promise is what it returns. It doesn't return the execution of the
But
function.
how can something with only one thread return anything while it's still running?
So that's the magic of JavaScript, because
I
JavaScript
mean, is it magic
single
or is it
thread.
just bastardizing the term thread?
JavaScript has worker threads.
Well,
I don't think thread is relevant.
yeah. So the way JavaScript works, in the mind of single threaded is, especially in Node, is the thread that the code is running on is one thread.
Okay.
It can do other things in background threads.
Okay.
And it will do an interrupt basically to the main thread to say, I'm doing this. And at that point, the main thread will do something else based on that interrupt, or it won't, depending on how your code is set up.
So in some sense, before you even get to the join, some things are already concurrent.
Yes. So that's the whole point.
Yeah.
These
The
two
join is not what makes
functions.
them concurrent. That's just where you wait for things.
Yeah.
Is there a graceful way to handle something that's going to be long and slow, and if you know you don't need to resolve it? Like if you do these two things, one of them fails very quickly, and you know you don't care what's going to happen next, you just want to stop with all the work. Can you cancel the one that's the slow learning process?
Well, do you need? So this is kind of where you want to start thinking about code architecturally more than trying to work with promises. Promises basically guarantee that something else will run at the end of the prior execution. So whether it should be run, whether a process is taking too long or not, that's kind of in your own realm, and it should be in the realm of how that maybe Spark function works. Maybe it has a timeout or a watchdog timer basically that says, this is taking 4 seconds longer than it needs to be. Let's already cut out and reject, or something like that.
But let's say you start two things and you only care about them if they both succeed.
Yeah, so that's what join is for.
Okay.
So it's only if they both succeed.
Right, but so in theory you'd like to stop the second one when the first one fails.
So like I said, you have to kind of think of the two different functions working separately, not with them having the ability to communicate with each other. There are other JavaScript patterns that allow for that, kind of like generators, and a few other ones that are in ES6 that allow you to have almost inter-process communication. I don't know, that's not the right term for it, so don't take all the connotations with that, but it's the closest thing I can think of that's along that lines. Yeah. Any other questions? So yeah, when a join is finally initiated, it's waiting for these two things to basically say I'm resolved. And if both of them, a promise will guarantee that it will either be resolved or rejected. If it doesn't do any of those two, the dot then that's waiting for that initial promise will wait forever. So there are scenarios, we were talking about this earlier, where if you have some long-running process and you have a dot then on it, it will wait until something gets resolved or rejected. And if you're in a state where nothing gets resolved or rejected, you will have basically almost like a memory leak, right? It'll just keep going.
Yeah.
So
how do you resolve that issue?
By throwing errors as soon as possible. So I think that's more of a how do you write good code
Exactly.
instead of promises. So we can hold off on that conversation toward the end if anyone still has questions on that.
Okay, that answers that question.
So what I was trying to get to is if they're both resolved, then the then will work. If either of them reject, then the catch will get triggered. So I think that's the biggest thing to kind of take away from that. So now that I've kind of shown you how to write promises, how they execute, and one cool trick with it. The question is, so why should I use promises? It's the future of JavaScript. I've kind of touched on this before. ES6 will come native with promises, and because callback hell kind of does suck.
Yeah.
If you're a very good JavaScript programmer, I don't know how you define good, but if you're an experienced programmer in JavaScript, then callback hell really isn't too much of a problem because you can always flatten callbacks. There's other things you can do to mitigate the indentation of a callback. And basically, promises aren't a way to completely eradicate callbacks whatsoever. Callbacks still have their place in JavaScript code, but to make things easier to read and more maintainable, promises are there to kind of give you a nice structure. Yes, that's a great way to put it. Thank you.
Just to go back to what I was saying earlier, you are right about the promise executing right away when you call new, but I found out it's because different implementations do this differently, and it also doesn't really matter when it runs because inherently when you write code in JavaScript, and this pertains to the thread question. So if you run code in JavaScript, you expect no code that you actually write should block. Everything that blocks is not in JavaScript. That's kind of like the rule for writing this crazy single-threaded type of mindset. And everything that is blocking on something else, like something in C++, if you're writing Node, will use the event emitter pattern and fire back into the JavaScript kind of event loop to notify if something is finished. So this is like the basis of how Node works. This is the basis of how Nginx works. So it's kind of like the event loop pattern.
And you're saying here that ES6 is adopting it, and it sounds like there's different kind of approaches. Is ES6 going to look like the A+ style, or?
So A+ is the actual spec.
Okay.
Which what I mean by
so
spec
Bluebird
is
matches what ES. It's almost like a polyfill.
No, A+ doesn't have join. So Bluebird actually has a lot of features that are not in the standard spec, but could be easily adapted for standard spec because it builds upon the basic features, right?
But Bluebird's going to look more like ES6's promises than say Angular's.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So while Bluebird does have a lot of extra tools that the actual spec, if you read it, is very small. All it says is it returns a then, pretty much, which is kind of hard to explain. They also say that the then has a callback, which has a resolve and a reject, and they kind of leave it at basically just that. There is nothing else other than that. So promises kind of builds on top of it to give you a lot of cooler features, or Bluebird, builds on top of it to give you features like join and a few other ones that I'll kind of show you towards the end. But for the most part, if you write things with Bluebird, they should be pretty much ES6 compatible. So it's also fast. I actually got into an argument with another developer about this just to really try and figure this out. So if you take a look at that link below, it's a pretty good blog article explaining, or actually going through a whole bunch of different concurrency libraries. So they use async, they use queue, I think they use when, and I think they use Bluebird, and they all compare it to native callbacks, either flattened or unflattened. Do you guys know what flattened and unflattened callbacks are?
No.
So an unflattened callback is if you had one callback, and inside of that callback, you had another function that called another callback, and another function, and it kind of just keeps recursively going on and on.
Anonymously defining the callback.
Yeah.
Makes it hierarchical, and then if you define it outside, then it becomes flat.
Yeah. So instead of having a callback that calls another function anonymously within that callback, you take this function, put it outside, so that it's flattened basically, so you don't have this long tree. And then there's tools like async that help you manage that a lot better as well. But compared to those tools, Bluebird is only 14% slower than unflattened callbacks. Unflattened callbacks are the fastest way to actually write it in JavaScript. And really, that difference doesn't really start to appear until you're doing about 10,000 operations a second, or 1 millisecond per IO operation. And that is incredibly fast. You've got to be writing your own database pretty much. That's kind of how I saw it, which is what we were doing at the time. And writing your own database operations to actually start seeing that lag.
Oh, I see, like big data.
Yeah. So just a comparison, async waterfall, which does basically a .then pattern, allows you to do a .then, basically chain functions one after the other, is about 300% slower than unflattened callbacks. So compared to the competition, it is not slow at all. It's almost as fast as native. And then once promises do go native, you don't even have this 14% performance hit.
Is it because it's the copy scope above? Is that what it is?
I'm not exactly sure. I know that
If it's reaching above, for like, say your callback is defined in the global scope,
yeah,
and then like you're reaching above in a callback instead of defining it within, like indented, then if you access anything outside of that scope, JavaScript actually
pulls in
duplicates your scope inside, which is why the performance aspect is slower if you define your callback in a higher scope, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. Does anyone know?
A lot of what I read too is that I'm gonna butcher his name, but I think it's Petka, the guy that wrote Bluebird. He's a performance freak when it comes to Node, so he pulled every performance trick out of the bag just to get promises to be as performant as it is. While other developers, Kaolan, I think, the guy that wrote async, may not have used those performance kind of tricks. So I mean that could just be the difference, whether you're using argument or not. And then Node has a whole bunch of performance optimizations that it uses in compilation time, not interpretation time. JIT, yeah. So that's going to be interpretation time, I think, that it does. And if you do, one or two things differently, it doesn't even try to optimize it.
Right.
So it could just be things like that, which is another reason why I really like Bluebird, because it's awesome that someone took care of all the performance stuff for me. So now I'll give you the real reason to use promises and what I've been trying to put off this entire time. So remember I was talking about like the positive scenario and the negative scenarios with callbacks, when you have to worry about only just resolving or rejecting a particular function within a promise. The real way you should write promises, you should only handle the positive scenario. All the negative scenarios, all the errors that you get from a callback, or any errors that you might get while doing like JSON.parse that are like kind of thrown errors that you wouldn't even see, you don't have to worry about those with promises, ever. Because what it does is basically, like I said earlier, it wraps a try-catch around everything. So once you start a promise and everything that's in that promise, you no longer have to worry about exceptions, errors, anything. You just write for the positive case, and you write all your promises such that everything is going how you would plan it to go. So if you're grabbing something from the database, you're going to write it as if it's always there. And if the database throws an exception, that you handle that in the catch towards the end. But all the thens along the way, you're going to basically say, yeah, I got everything. There's no exceptions. You never have to do a if value equals or if value, those crazy if statements to basically default values if they're not there, things like that. So I kind of talk about that a little bit here. So if you throw, basically another thing with promises is you're kind of free to throw errors as much as you want, and it's actually probably a good idea to throw it as soon as possible. If there's any type of error that you come across, maybe the initial function is asking for 2 parameters and one of them is undefined, just throw an error right there. Like, don't even worry about it. Just keep throwing errors all over the place because they're all going to be caught here, and you'll be able to handle those errors. Yeah, just throw them like cats.
Awesome.
Throw them. Again, the callback form is kind of heavy in the sense that basically you have this extra parameter, which is a callback you have to call at the end of the function, and then you also have to return. You either return the result or you have to handle this error. And then another function that calls some function needs to check if the error that's coming out of there exists or not. So every time you have a callback, you have to check to see if the error exists. And basically with promises, you never have to check. You don't have to make that check anymore. You always assume that the value is going to be there. And you don't have to pass on errors too, because a lot of times if you do have an error and you have a set of callbacks kind of chained, if you have an error at the top of that stack, well, now you're going to pass that error along with you to the bottom, to the next callback, to the next callback, and the next callback, just so you don't lose that error. And that kind of sucks. I'd rather just throw an error as soon as I see one, and then basically your .catch will take care of the stack trace and everything for you. It'll tell you exactly where the error is thrown sometimes. And I think that's the real reason that I really like promises, because I don't have to worry about errors anymore. So I can write a whole bunch of code, especially if you're writing with happy or something that's promise-ified already. You don't have to worry about basically, well, is my JavaScript code going to crash the server? Because no, it'll never crash the server as long as you always use a promise. You'll just get a 500 error. And then you just have to look through your logs and figure out what happened. But at least you'll never run into the scenario where you write some code, you maybe switched some 2 letters, you throw it into production, and all of a sudden the server never starts again.
I think there's one caveat that might happen is if you start to refer to things out of like 2 or more scopes above the promise, you might run into some.
Yeah, obviously, I am kind of embellishing a little bit. If you do some crazy stuff, like you do a Stack Overflow exception within a promise, you're probably gonna crash more than just your application.
Yeah.
If you do some memory leaks and you do some other things, you're probably going to crash the entire server instead of just your application. So those things like that, you probably wouldn't be able to handle anyway. You kind of have to write that architecturally. You got to architect your code to not run into those situations. Any questions on that? I think that's my biggest point. It's the whole reason to use promises. No errors. So can I use it now?
Yes.
Yes, there's plenty of promise libraries out there. Of course, my favorite is Bluebird, which is by Petka Antonov. There's RSVP, Cujo, 625, and Tracer Compiler are another options where you can just write the native promises and have it compiled into JS5. So yeah, there's plenty of options. This is only a few of them. When I started searching, when I first started using promises about a year and a half, 2 years ago, year and a half ago, there was like maybe 2 libraries. Now there's like 24, I think. And it's crazy.
You can use Bluebird in Browserify. I
Yeah.
think it was finalized in the beginning of 2014.
I think you can actually just inject Bluebird straight into your browser.
Really?
Yeah, you
Oh,
don't need
Oh,
to use it with
yeah,
Node.
I was reading that too.
That's cool.
So that's pretty cool. And so now we're gonna move on to how I was talking about you can move between callbacks and promises. So this is how you would turn a native callback into a promise. So basically, you would have a function and some input, and you return a promise right off the bat. And there's some function. Okay, all right, I read this wrong. Sorry. So some function is a callback function that you're trying to turn into a promise. It's got an input and it's got a callback that you would usually call. And basically, you would handle it like a regular callback. If error, you would reject, and else you would resolve. And that's basically it. And because you're returning a promise off the bat, you're returning the promise that this function is going to get resolved at some point. And that's it, really. It's pretty simple.
That's what Promisify does.
Basically, for the most part, Promisify. So I didn't talk about this yet. The Bluebird library. There's a lot to talk about.
Too much.
So the Bluebird library has something called Promisify. It's a function that takes in another function and will basically return you a Promisified version of that function.
Interesting.
And at that point, you can use that original function as if it was a promise.
That's awesome.
Anyone understand that?
Wait,
How many-
you've already written it as callbacks?
Yeah. So
All
you
you're getting is a 14% performance hit or 1.4 or whatever it was?
you're getting a performance hit, but you're
Right.
getting code that's more maintainable.
Okay. Oh, so you're not just taking the, when you say return a function, return the text of the function, not just some abstract callable function.
No, it returns you the abstract
Separate.
callable function.
It actually returns.
Well, how is it more maintainable if the actual code that you have is still the callback version?
So it's more maintainable because you don't have to work with that function as a callback anymore. You can work with it as a promise now.
Okay.
It's mostly for libraries that were written in callback style. And
Yeah.
you want to change it into something that works with
Okay,
promise.
so you're changing the interface to the thing you already
I see.
So the downside to that is it assumes the node callback signature, which is pretty much the error result in the signature.
I see.
So if you have something that has multiple returns or multiple parameters,
No, it works.
it works.
It works. What it does is after the error, the promise when it
that's right.
resolves, it'll throw it back in our array.
Okay.
Actually, it works.
Throws it.
All right,
You
never
can actually
mind.
promise by an entire library.
Yeah. So that's what I was gonna get to. There's a Promisify all function that allows you to dump in an entire library,
Oh, that's
and it'll give you
awesome.
back the entire library with all the methods on that library Promisified.
Oh, okay. So it's just wrapping it all.
Yeah. So and the great thing about it too is it doesn't just return you all the methods as promises. It actually creates a new mirrored set of those original functions. So if you had a library with 4 functions, it'll actually return you 8 functions. The original 4 functions, but 4 more functions that's a Promisified version of the first 4 functions.
Oh, I see. Awesome.
So the only difference is, say if the first function was get, the Promisified version would be called get async.
I see.
So if you wanted to use the Promisified version, you would call it get async, and that would return you a promise. But you can still go back and use the regular get, which will return you back a callback,
Okay.
or which will require a callback.
That's awesome.
So that's what I meant about 2-3 slides ago.
Yep.
Where is it? Yeah. No. No.
Escaped is not.
But I don't know where it was. Whatever.
Whatever. That's party tricks.
Okay. So other way around.
Have you tried it across a lot of functions? Like, does it, if it sees one, it doesn't know how to handle the method signature? Does it spit it out and be like, I can't promisify this for you?
I don't think it gives you errors. It just
Yeah.
does whatever it wants.
it tries best fit, and if it doesn't work, then it blows up in
If you
production.
respect the library and you know the person did a good job, you run Promisify all and just
No, I'm thinking more like how your stuff is going into it and how it's going to get handed
Oh
back.
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if you follow this pattern, then your code's always gonna be good.
Okay.
And you can call Promisify on your own methods too that you create, or functions
see.
that you create.
I see. So basically, it's an issue of how you structured your code.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a signature for the callback.
Okay. Okay, that
So-
makes sense.
Here's another way around where you can return a callback from a promised function. So you have some promise function, and it takes in an input, and basically all you do is you do the opposite. You do a .then, and if you get a result, then you return the callback with it undefined and result.
Okay.
This is your normal error. And if you have an error, you catch the error, and then you just call back with the error. Pretty simple, right?
Yep.
So you can easily go back and forth between callbacks and promises. And I actually do this a lot with our code base. So a lot of times I'll write a function in callback form, and in one particular scenario, I really want it to be a promise, so I'll just promisify it on the fly, and ta-da, done. I don't even need Bluebird. Yeah.
That's
so
awesome.
the reason why you would do this is because of if another library expects like a callback style.
Mhm.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's really the only reason. Otherwise, what is there's a promisify? What is this called? Helify?
No.
I like that one.
It's actually called notify.
Notify.
Yeah.
Notify. Oh,
So-
that's really nice. Okay.
Yeah. So
Qualify. I like that one.
the Bluebird library simplifies this for you. You can just call notify on a function, and it'll do the same thing as
Oh, I see.
this, basically.
It's a two-way translation.
Yeah.
You can wrap and unwrap. Okay,
That's it,
that's awesome.
So party tricks.
Tricks.
We're pretty much done with the bulk of what promises are, how to build them, when you would want to use them, how you would use them, and how to kind of go between callbacks and promises. I'm going to show you a few party tricks that I've kind of found while using promises. This first one is actually James's, and it's pretty awesome when he showed it to me, because it kind of blew my mind as soon as I saw it. So basically, you can start a promise two different ways, like based on your parameters. Like if you get a Medusa, then you do your promise is a Medusa.stare function, or if you get a Hydra, you get a Hydra.swallow function. But only one or the other will fire, and basically it's like, whoa, two different promises, but only one of them actually get run. And then at the end you do a kill 9 on a monster. This was in remember our import method?
Oh,
Where you
right,
defer the
right.
promise creation?
Oh, yeah, different.
Yeah.
So like the analogy would be like you have a bunch of functions that would be handled by this method or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
that is determined by like some kind of config.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So based on our parameters,
Not
I
as
get passed in.
exciting as Medusa and Hydra, but
Yeah.
we try to
Yeah.
Hey,
your
make have
imagination.
fun.
Yeah. So basically, you can start different promises based on your parameters,
Okay.
and then at the end too, you can handle what happens after that, as long as the .then and .catch kind of works for both functions.
Okay. I see. Party tricks.
So another tool.
I love this one. Been playing too much Final Fantasy recently.
So this is promise.map.
I
So
like this one.
a lot of the array type methods also exist in Bluebird library.
Mm-hmm.
So .map, .each, and I think .sum also works.
Awesome.
So this basically, you guys all know what a map does, right?
Yeah.
It basically just does a map across an array of functions. So if you have an array of promises, sorry. So if your Final Fantasy summons parameter is an array of Final Fantasy summons, if you guys don't know what those are monsters. It's an array of monsters. And for each monster, you're going to get the monster's name.
Yeah.
And then you're going to return to the .then under that an array of monster names, summon names. And then you're basically going to console all of those out. So it's going to give you this nice array of summons. So you return that array of names again. And then basically for each one of these, so this is a promise within a promise.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, blow your mind there. For each name, you're going to summon them. So this will return you now an array of monsters and not just monster names. And then at the end, you do a catch if your summon fails. You get hit during the middle of that. What's up?
So what am I getting if I do promise that each summon names instead of like summon names dot for each tab?
It's actually okay. So it depends. In this scenario, we're gonna say that Final Fantasy summons is just an array of objects, so they're not promises. So in that scenario, you're fine because you can do a for each.
Okay.
The reason why you would want to do a promise at each is if you had an array of promises. So if you had an array of promises, huh?
It'll do the smart thing then if I.
Yes.
So
So if you had
each with a join wrapped up.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah, basically. So if you had an array of promises, so you create an array and you put functions in each one.
Mm-hmm.
Promise.each will wait until all the functions are done, and then it'll iterate on whatever the values returned for each function is.
Sweet.
Yeah, so if,
Function or each promise?
well, sorry. they're kind of the same, but each promise. So create an array, create an array of size 4, load each of the 4 with a promise. Promise.each will wait till all 4 promises are complete, and then we'll take the return value of each promise and basically apply that function to the return value of each promise. So if you had an array of, let's say, get tweets, you had a function called get tweets, and you called it 4 different times with 4 different hashtags. Promise.each will basically wait till all 4 functions have returned, and each 4, say they all return one tweet. Now you have an array of 4 tweets, and then you can do a .each on that and actually console log each tweet. So it'll basically wait until all 4 get tweet functions are kind of done.
And the array will still be in the same order that you originally eached them in?
Yes, each and map both preserve order.
So if the individual functions like return an array of tweets, then you would have a 2D array.
Yeah, you would.
But then there's tools to flatten it out.
Yeah, low dash or something like that. And the nice thing about this too is if anything goes wrong anywhere in the middle of this, it just goes straight to the .catch. So if you're trying to map something and one of your summons maybe is just undefined, from here it'll just go straight to the .catch.
Okay.
Console log is kind of easy. But say this other summon function, if one of them just happens to not be able to be summoned, then instead of having an error here and trying to figure out what's going on here, you go straight to this .catch and then you'll be told summon failed.
Makes sense.
Alternatively too, if you want to get really tricky, you can actually put
Tricky.
you can put a .catch at the end of this promise. This promise.each.
Well, you summon them, so
Yep. There you
I don't
go.
want to waste my turn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Summon.
Or you could do a .catch inside this summon. So if that summon fails itself, you can actually tell it to return something else, right? So,
Oh, I see.
so you get all your summons, only the ones that actually made it survive. That survived. Then you're good.
Yeah. Okay. Makes
Yeah,
sense.
you're good. Knights it around, man.
Oh yeah, Knights of the Round. 13 of that. That took forever.
Okay. Last party trick. I think this is the last one. So this is the whole advanced errors scenario where you've got .thens and .errors and .catches and .thens again. So this one might take a little bit to explain. I guess take a while to read through it and try to see if you can figure out what the hell's going on, because I gotta do that too. I don't remember writing this.
When did you make?
All right. So you get a promise,
Okay.
resolve reject. You get some input. You want to test that input.
Okay.
If the input's good, so think of it as a synchronous function,
Yeah.
test input. It returns you whether it's valid or not. So if it's valid, you resolve your bad input because it's not really bad anymore. But if it's an error, or if it's not, then you just throw an error. And in this case, I'm using a promise.operational error, which is something that Bluebird also gives you. So what's the best way to explain this? Okay, so an operational error, you know how if you have a callback, the callback signature is error and value.
Right.
An operational error is considered when you get an error in that callback. So when you throw an operational error, that actually gets caught in this .error.
I see.
So that's kind of one way to do multiple error handling with Bluebird. So now you can throw different types of errors, and different parts of Bluebird will actually get fired off.
I
So
see.
if you throw an operational error, only this will get called. The .catch won't get called, and the .then will get called.
I see.
So you get this console log that says input was naughty, instead of saying something that shouldn't happen happened.
So .error only catches operational errors.
Yeah. So
The
you gotta.
operational error should always have a .error
Yeah.
somewhere in its chain.
Yeah. Well, so that's the other thing. So if you don't have this .error, .catch will also catch you.
Oh, okay.
So a .catch is going to be a catch-all. It's your default catch-all.
Okay.
A .catch will catch every error, no matter what. So you can always put that at the end of something and just say something fucking went wrong here. Console log this shit
But
and make sure someone sees it.
So if you call reject, then that's caught by the error.
No, that will be a reject is not the same as an operational error, so it'll be caught in the .catch.
okay.
It's only if you throw an operational error
I
that
see.
.error will catch. That'll
Yeah, the regular
catch it.
square also
I
does
see.
that.
Okay. Input is not.
If you don't have a .error, it'll go to the catch.
Interesting.
So then you have valid input because this verifies. Again, we're running with the positive scenario in here, right?
Right.
We're always going to make sure that whatever came before follow the positive path of this positive scenario. So we're going to say at this point, our input's valid.
Okay.
It's no longer bad input because if we got to this point, we know for a fact that this error wasn't thrown, it was resolved. So we know our input's valid.
Mm-hmm.
Do something with it. And then we're going to pass on some results.
Okay.
So we're going to test those results now. And basically, if the results are valid, keep passing the results on. But if there's an error with the results, which probably shouldn't happen, we're going to throw a regular error. And that's going to get caught by the dot catch. And at this point, the dot catch will say something that shouldn't happen happened.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of these two, at the end, you're going to say something anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like a more advanced way to handle errors. Bluebird also actually has many different sets of errors. I'm not going to go through all of them because they're kind of hard to explain. Like operational error was pretty much the easiest one. But you can assume that dot catch will always catch all errors.
Okay.
If you want to go into the more advanced topics, dot catch can actually take a parameter before the function. And that parameter will be used by Bluebird to check what kind of error it is. So you can define your own error types. You can say, let's create a input is not defined error. So maybe you don't get any input. And you can throw that right at the top of the promise. So you can define that error through Bluebird. And then when you do a dot catch, you can put a dot catch before your catch-all dot catch and say input not defined error. And it'll check that the error that was thrown up here is an input not defined error, and basically it will throw that dot catch, or it'll run that dot catch instead of the overall dot catch.
I didn't know you can put a dot then after a catch.
Yeah, you can. Yeah,
Not with
it's
that
weird.
semicolon, though.
Wait.
Oh, snap!
What was that?
Got me.
No, I'm not even that.
Yeah, that was semicolon.
Hey, Ed,
I was staring at that for a while.
it's gonna be 8:00, and I have to go, and some students probably have to go too.
Okay.
And then of course, students, if you want to stay longer till the end, they probably have to do it now. So if you have questions now,
Yep.
it'd be good before.
The only other thing is I'm going to tell you how promises work on the back end, but I mean that really doesn't matter because that's only if you really want to get into theoretical stuff. So if you've got questions, ask it now.
Alright.
Nothing.
Okay.
Chat.
Oh, I have a question. So you had that dot then there.
Yeah.
What about like what's the difference between putting a dot finally there or
Dot finally.
yeah.
Finally, it doesn't return a promise after that.
Yeah, that's another thing. Finally doesn't return a promise afterwards. So once you do a dot finally, it's kind of like that's the end of the promise. So if you want to do a dot then and maybe continue that promise. So a lot of times you might want to do a whole bunch of catches within the context, within a chain of a set of promises. So that maybe at the top you do some function, you want to do a catch there to make sure that, whatever, if you have any exceptions, you catch that exception, that particular exception there and console log it, but maybe you want to continue on and do some more operations, and then you do a dot catch after that particular operation. You want to catch a particular function at that point, and then do some more operations. You can actually keep going on with the chain because, again, you're only thinking about the positive scenario, and the dot catches are there to help you catch all the negative scenarios and maybe console log them. But you can still continue on with the action. So promises allow you to kind of sidestep errors and just keep going if you want to. But a dot finally will basically say, all right, all the operations for this promise chain are done. So now let's do some cleanup, basically. Let's close some connections. Let's, return flow of control back to the UI, or maybe update the UI at the end of this promise chain or something like that. That's what you would use a dot finally for. Basically, that says, all the work for this promise is done. Let's go update UI or something like that.
Thank you.
Yep. Any more questions? All right, I'm gonna go into the theoretical stuff. Not so theoretical, but basically, I know. All right. Gonna take a 5-minute intermission while everyone leaves. and I talk to myself.
Hey, this is cool actually. I like the fact that you can wrap it and then unwrap it. Those
Yeah,
two ways.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. No problem.
Okay.
And just look at the documentation. This is cool. So what other features of ES6 besides promises?
There's generators. There's a few other things that I haven't really looked at. The arrow function looks pretty fun. Pretty
Which one?
arrow.
That?
No, it's arrow operator. That arrow operator. That's
What does
pretty
that
weird.
do?
I'm not completely sure, but it allows you to, I think, create a new object, predefined.
Interesting.
Oh, there's also default to multiple returns too. That's pretty
Okay.
cool. I don't know. I'm not too.
Oh,
I'm not
multiple
too happy
return
about
times.
multiple objects returned. Sorry.
I see.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go ahead with the behind the scenes stuff. So a dot then isn't really just one function that it takes. A dot then, depending on the library, can actually take 3 functions. And really, if you look at the spec basically says a dot then is 2 functions. So if you look at the initial new promise, it had a resolve and a reject.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what a dot then does. A dot then gives you a new promise that gives you a resolve and a reject. But what happens is, depending on where you put that function, it's a resolve or it's a reject. So if you do a dot then with one parameter, it's always going to be a resolve. But if you pass null and then another function, it's handling a reject. Or in other words, it becomes a dot catch. So a dot then with a null and a function becomes a dot catch.
Right.
Because everything in the long run, all this catch, error, and all this other stuff, they're just mutations of what dot then is.
Yeah.
Everything is a thenable, right? So everything really is a dot then with a set number of callbacks. So if we take away Angular, we only have to resolve and reject.
Mm-hmm.
And if the promise before this was resolved, then the first function will get called. And that's a dot then that we know and love. But if the previous promise got rejected, then instead of calling the first function, it actually calls the second function. Technically, it becomes a dot catch. And there's a third one with Angular called a dot notify, where you can actually spam this function.
For like progress meters and stuff.
Yeah, so that's what we use it for. So if you had a progress meter, you can hit a promise and say, I want to do a dot notify instead of a dot resolve or a dot reject, and this function will get fired. So this is a good way to do like progress bars or something where, if you upload something and every chunk that goes through, you call it a dot notify, and then basically this thing will update the UI saying add another % or whatever. So again, like a dot then is really just a function with 2 nulls at the end, where a dot catch is really a null and then a function and another null.
Can you do dot notify style things with Bluebird?
Not right now. The library doesn't really support it because notify isn't promise spec compliant, so it won't add it. But I've seen it in other libraries, so I figure I'd throw it in there just in case.
If you're writing Node and you're like, you have stream stuff and you wanted to get like progress from a stream thing, you kind of like have to write your own identifier.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. I see.
That's probably the best way to do it. So that's really like how dot then or dot catch, dot error, and all those other things are really just all dot thens in the long run. It just depends on where you put the parameters.
Right.
All right, I'm done.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
How would you go to native, like once all the browsers support it and stuff? Is it
How would I go to native?
or,
For a while, to be honest, I wouldn't. I would just keep using the Bluebird library, in my opinion. I would hope that he would release a ES6 native version, so you no longer have the 14% hit on performance, but you would still get all the functions that he supplies you with, like the dot join, the dot errors,
extra
and
stuff? Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
So I'm kind of crossing my fingers and hoping he releases an ES6 native version.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't have to worry about it right now. In the long run, if you really want to be I guess, compliant with ES6, you cannot use some of his tools like join and map and each, and just do it as an array. So especially for map, each, and join, it's the same thing as just doing an array and then waiting for all the promises to resolve. So the things that he's kind of giving you are things you can just do on your own anyway. It's just syntactic sugar on top of how you use the library. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're ever really curious, just go through his code base. I mean, it's all open source, so just take a look and see how he does it. Yeah. Any other questions? I don't think I have any more slides.
That's awesome.
Anyone want to go through like examples, I guess? You can give like a happy example on the fly.
How about extend the...
Who uses Express? Who uses Happy?
Happy.
I think does Express support promises out of box?
I don't know. I haven't used Express in so long. I'm not sure.
Why would you use Happy over it? Or like when would you...
Happy has it's a bigger beast. I think Express is a simpler. Like if you want to get things going really quickly, I think Happy would be harder to do that with. But Express, you would have to use more dependencies if you want things like security features.
So I'm gonna do this on the fly.
What's Express? Express is coding on the fly.
Kind of like Sinatra.
We need to do this more. Someone needs to come here and code this.
Exactly. It's one thing to talk about this, but to see it actually written live demos exactly.
My syntax may not be the greatest, but we're gonna try.
As long as it works.
Yeah, I'm not gonna compile this, so whatever. All right. So this is how you'd handle routes in Happy. So you define all your routes in an array, but this is just one object in the array. So you'd say this is handle get on /test, and when /test gets called, this is the function that you're gonna fire, and it's got a request and a reply.
Okay.
So what we've been typically doing is we'll call promise, and maybe promise will be. Let's just do this for now. So I define.
Do you require in that promise, or it's already part
Yeah.
of
So let's assume that Bluebird's already in here, right? So we can do var promise equals required. Yeah. So you get a promise. We'll say promise equals.
Why is it on a separate line?
So I've been doing it on a separate line because I could. I'll show you why. Give me a second.
Well, actually,
Let's do it this way.
It's fine if maybe if you end up moving it outside of the scope, then you don't have to change much code.
Yeah.
I see.
Let's say var user equals request dot payload dot user. So you get a user there. So your promise will become a function that takes in user. No, let's do this. Let's do this and return you promise function resolve reject. I really miss my autocomplete code editing at this point. And say we have some db.getUser. We give user here. So notice that it's going out past the scope of the promise to grab user and basically returning that.
So db.getUser returns a promise?
Yeah, let's say it does.
So in that case, you don't have to return new promise. We can just assume that the get user is the promise, right?
Yeah. What the fuck happened? All right. So yeah, let's say this returns a promise. All right, let's make it easy then.
Yeah. Yes.
Alright.
User is already a perfect, thing that's already been written.
Shoot.
Returns you a promise.
Honestly, if we're gonna go that route, we don't even need all of this stuff. Like we can just straight up just yeah.
What the hell? Okay.
And then return reply promise. But so that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to show you was the fact that like if you do this format with Happy, that actually basically when your request is finished, you call reply with whatever your values are. So if you want to say status to 100, you can just put in you can just call reply and it'll automatically give you a status to 100 on the request. Or in this case, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pass in a promise. So what's pretty cool about that is anything outside of the promise is fair game to throw an exception and crash the server. But because all I'm really doing is getting a payload.user, and let's assume it's always there. There's things you can do like do validate. I think it's yeah, okay. So it's payload and user joy dot string dot required or
So does it have to be Bluebird or can it use anything else?
what do you mean?
Like for Happy?
No, it doesn't matter.
It
Doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter.
Yeah, you can anything that returns a promise because it's all it's gonna do is call a dot then and attach a dot catch to it. So you can ignore the validate line, but if you really want to know, that's how Happy validates that something is on the payload object. It'll ensure that it's there, and if it's not, it'll actually not even run your code. It'll actually go back and tell the caller, hey, you screwed up. It'll actually return a 400 bad requests, and it'll actually tell the user what they did wrong. So in this case, it'll say, I'm saying that that user is an object and it has to be required. And if the user isn't passed in to this route, then it'll just automatically kick back. So really, this should be a post because you can't do a payload on a get.
I see.
What would happen if db.getUser threw an exception instead of returning a promise?
So that's the awesome part. So because Happy as a framework has adopted promises, at this point I don't have to worry about it. I don't care if it does, because you know what? Happy's gonna take care of that for me. It's gonna attach a dot catch at the end of this promise for me, and basically it'll return a service 500 error.
Wow, I see.
I don't even have to worry about it.
What if you wanted to customize the error?
If you want to customize the error, you could always do it yourself, right? You can always do dot catch function. Let's return boom dot.
And this could be defined where you define get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you guys are wondering about these ridiculous names for libraries, they're actually the Walmart lab stack for the happy ecosystem. So Joy is the validation, and Boom is the
Boom.
Actually, you could do a not found here. That's probably a better one. Oops. And do user not found. So in this case, like instead of letting Happy handle the error and throw a 500, I'm going to say, well, there's an error getting the user, so I'm going to dot catch that. I'm going to catch that error coming out of that promise, and basically I'm going to return a boom dot not found, which is Happy's way of declaring like a not found error. So at this point, all I'm doing is returning this promise, and I don't have to worry about any error exception handling at all, other than saying if there is an error, just say the user is not found.
So the default catch for like when you do replies go to a 500.
Yeah, it's a default 500. So
what would happen if you didn't have that validate on there and then the payload did not have a user?
Again, it depends on like since payload is not going to have user, this first line is still going to be fine. It's going to be user is just going to be undefined, right?
Yeah.
because payload as object will still be there. User is just undefined.
Yeah.
So you're gonna pass undefined to get user, and at that
Yeah.
point there's gonna be an exception there at some point, hopefully. And then at that point the dot catch will catch it, and you can say boom, user not found. Or
How does that catch that if it doesn't return a promise?
so we're saying that db.getUser does return a promise.
Oh, okay.
So that's what we're saying at this point.
So what if the first line threw an error somehow, or somewhere in your handler function?
Oh, okay. So if you did some crazy function, some stupid function
Yeah.
here first, right?
Mhm.
With requests for some reason. Yeah, if you had an error there, then your server crashes and burns. Like it's you gotta hope to God you have forever running, and basically it'll just restart the server. But yeah, so the reason why I do it this way is because I encapsulate all the work in the promise, and I never have to worry about that.
Mhm.
So I would rather do something like this, where I do stupid function here. I have a mechanical keyboard. This is screwing me over. And then do a dot then. Yeah. At that point, this would be, I want to return this function. And then do that, right? So I do the stupid function first, and if there's an error, I catch it below it, and not found error and function. So I'm gonna write this ahead of time, but I'll show you what I'm gonna do with this. Dot bad requests. Or it's not gonna be bad input error. Boom dot bad requests.
Yeah, it doesn't even need a compiler.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So say like there is a stupid function. Well, make it part of the promise, and then you never have to worry about it, because if there's an exception here, it'll get caught somewhere around here, and you do user not found or whatever.
Mhm.
Then you can continue on doing other stuff. So the whole point is basically do things that won't throw an exception outside of the promise, but if you do have a promise in this context, make sure it's always part of the promise chain, so that it'll always handle that error. And another thing too, like maybe you do get user, and for some reason stupid function will kill your user, right? It deletes it by accident. So now you can throw a bad input error, and that bad input error actually will get caught over here and will return a different error. Instead of returning a not found, it will return a bad request saying bad input, user not found, or something like that, right?
Yep.
Whereas this dot catch will catch stupid function and say, it will say stupid function. And then otherwise it'll just return the user, because at this point the user is going to get returned.
Mhm.
So how is that first catch working again? What is bad input error?
So remember how I was telling you that promises Bluebird allows you to create or define your own kind of errors?
Yeah.
You can actually I don't know how to do it off the top of my head, but you'd have to check the Bluebird library, but you can define different types of errors. And if you throw those types of errors, you can actually define what kind of error gets caught in the dot catch.
Okay.
So in this dot catch, it will only catch bad input errors that I've created.
Right.
Well, the second dot catch will catch everything else after that.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh,
So it's
you can
nice.
so you can isolate.
Yeah, you
Errors.
can isolate the errors that are being thrown from the promise.
I see. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a pretty awesome library in my opinion.
Yeah. Bluebird.
Is this a common pattern with I guess promises that you can kind of design this supervisor kind of handling kind of thing that does all these things for you? Is that an advantage of promises?
I don't know if it's built with that in mind. The basic idea, and I think what kind of comes out of that basic idea is that the basic idea is basically we want to make sure exceptions are caught, and you can always run something synchronously after this particular function. But because of that nature, you can do things like supervisor. Yeah. So it wasn't really built with that in mind, but it kind of allows you to do stuff like that. There's actually
The tools to do that if happening if you want.
yeah, there's actually other ways to do this too with some of the other ES6 tools out there.
You can do this with callbacks somehow? I don't
Hmm?
this pattern kind of work with callbacks.
You could, but I wouldn't trust it as much. It's mainly because once you go back into the callback realm, you're kind of broken free of the promise. So if you throw an exception there,
Anything could happen.
anything could happen, yeah, basically, and you could crash the server. So with promises, I like it because you kind of get that like security blanket saying,
Like a sandbox.
yeah, well, it kind of is.
I guess it's more like defined, the behavior is more defined.
Yeah, yeah.
It's definitely more advantageous to use a promise library if you're working in a framework like Happy.
Yeah,
I see.
If you have a structured way to handle like input and output like a web server, it like totally makes sense. The only time that I would favor callbacks over promises, and in general, I actually like it might not look like it, but I actually favor callbacks over promises for the most part. But only when you're working with modules that are well designed and defined. I think like smaller modules, because my theory is that if you design things well and if you write callbacks the way they should be written, then it's more truly a functional style. The reason why you would use a promise library is to make your code more readable in an imperative manner.
I see.
So, go ahead.
Is it because that some people don't know how to write code very well?
Well, it kind of helps you with that. It helps novice programmers not to.
Yeah. More like they know how to write code well in different ways that don't work together.
Yeah.
Yeah. The styles, incompatible writing styles. Yeah, I can see.
Because JavaScript lets you kind of like it kind of allows you to shoot yourself in the foot very easily.
Oh yeah, that was one of my concerns.
Like one of the good things to kind of use callbacks over promises for is if you want a whole bunch of anonymous functions, maybe not anonymous, but name functions that you just want to fire and forget.
Okay.
Callbacks are good for that, and just give it a no op for a callback.
Okay.
That's kind of downplaying it though. Like there's definitely more things that callbacks probably would be more effective, especially if you want to have like kind of like a spider call of operations.
I see. Yeah, I see that. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So does anyone on the virtual side have any questions? We're gonna maybe start closing this up soon. Anyone else have questions? Well, if you guys want, I'll stay and I'll talk more about promises. But you guys are free to leave if you want. Kind of in an hour and a half.
So I mean, I know I'm reading this a little bit because I'm not. I'm going to program in the '80s, so things are my worldview is different. So a join is like a barrier. It effectively blocks if one of the promises goes into an infinite loop or something, right?
Yep, pretty much.
So you can essentially have blocking going on if you don't write your code carefully.
Yep.
But every line of code that you write should never block.
Right.
If it
Each
does,
individual.
that's
Right. Well, right. But if you have an infinite loop, that's like, and even in the promise, once you start waiting for it, then it
Right. So it'll block until all your promises return.
Right.
Cooper, can you do a join as like timeout?
No, but they have a function called I think race, which okay. So I'm just gonna bring up Bluebird's library. So he's got some crazy functions that I don't even know how to use.
Well, you have something. If you have a timer, and if the timer finishes first, then
Well, what you would do is you would do a set timeout.
Yeah.
Jason, in like another promise that you would add to the join, and then you make that reject when it hits that timeout.
Oh yeah.
So I mean,
and then it'll stop waiting.
Right, and or you make it pass or something, and then you get everything up to that point, right?
I see.
I mean, I take back what I said about reject, but that doesn't really make sense if you were expecting what's happening before. You know, because that particular promise needs to finish anyway, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay, that makes sense.
Then if you expect 15 promises to resolve, and only 13 come back, then maybe at that point you raise an error.
I see. Makes sense.
So that's how you would solve that problem.
Or you can use a dot sum.
Dot sum.
So I don't know when you would ever use some of these functions. Like .sum basically starts a race between multiple promises, and whatever the minimal amount of promises you want to happen fulfill, you just take those two.
Oh wait, so you can do something like you can effectively wait for instead of waiting for all of a set of things to finish, you can wait for
Yeah, so you define it right here.
Just you can basically
Right,
when
so
one of these things
that's fun.
finishes.
you want
Yeah.
to hit like multiple API servers. Let's say like you're hitting a widely available service, right?
Like a
Right.
botnet attack.
I love that one.
Hey man,
Thank you. Hey, that's fun.
So-
That's the best
So
one.
you go ahead and hit a whole bunch of servers, and you only care about like one response.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't care about the other.
Oh, yeah, this is fun.
And then
already.
dot race is a weird one too, because I think it only waits till one promise finishes out of the array, and then you're
I
good.
see.
That's what I was,
Someone.
I was
Yeah.
describing. Right?
Yeah, which you can build. Yeah, you can build one out of the other, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it could be.
So all of these you can
They're all
actually
like,
Yeah.
you can build on your
Oh
own.
yeah, you could nest
Right,
them.
or you could just, you could just have like a loop where every time you have a bunch of things happening, and every time one finishes, you figure out what you want to be, and then you just go back to the top of the loop and wait for another one to finish.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's
That's-
kind of hard
that
to
should be
read.
fun.
Sort of
Oh,
like
man.
sort of like an
The-
extra,
the
sort of
race
like
does
another
actually
event
take
loop
a-
inside the
Yeah.
event.
Yeah. How about infinite?
Yeah.
Like sit there, you sit.
No,
Well,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be
yeah,
infinite,
no,
you can-
it's
because you could.
I know, I know.
You can
So
jump out
you would
when
do-
when you have whatever the final goal was.
No,
They all take that?
just to make it,
They all take
to
a rave?
freeze the thing.
No,
No.
because
It's a
you
joke.
can't-
I know.
You always
It's a joke.
do.
It's a joke.
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
They haven't written a language yet that you can't write a broken program in.
it's impossible.
So yeah, what else is there? You can do a reduce.
Rules are so ingenious.
You can do a filter. You can do each. There's a settle. I don't even know what this does.
So the each and the map, they run every element nominally, at least potentially every element in the array is being computed at the same time. Is that right?
No, I don't think so. If you do each, I think. So JavaScript is single threaded, right? So it's gonna go
Return
through.
to promise as if all the items in the array are their code. I don't know why that's called settle. But basically, this makes sure that everything in the array eventually reaches a promise.
Okay.
If there's anything in JavaScript that says things are running in parallel,
Yeah.
it's actually like when it's happening in the back. First of all of your code should never block, right?
Right.
But all it's saying is that it's not running things in order.
Right.
Because it's it's
Well, even-
single
well-
threaded. There's no way it can run.
Well, but right, but
simultaneously.
but in some sense, it's doing its own threading then, because I mean, remember there were threads before there were multiprocessors.
Right,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I'm talking about just the JavaScript.
Right.
Okay.
What JavaScript calls out to, let's
Yeah.
say like a
Oh, I forgot about
something
tab.
to get things from your database
Yeah.
would do its own thing.
I think we can
Right,
can
right.
shut down the,
Right,
the
but
virtual
right,
side.
so, right. So I guess it's not.
Thanks
it's not
for-
really clear
thanks for
what
coming,
each-
everyone.
Each function is doing, right?
Yeah, and then that's
It's pretty long.
depends on. I mean, you just have to know like
Right.
how
Goodbye.